Hi, and welcome to Good Reasons to Believe. I'm Daniel Vecchio. I'll be guest hosting on behalf of Alan Darley, who's not here this week. And the title of my talk today is, Are there any good reasons to think that the moral arguments are any good? I'm going to address a few of the versions of the moral argument for God's existence. Basically, the moral arguments seek to establish God's existence based on certain moral facts about the universe, the fact that we feel obligations and duties, and that we have a sense that those obligations and duties are objective and mind independent. So I'm going to try to unpack a few versions of the moral argument today, and then I will address some of the common objections to them. So the first one, and probably the most well-known if you follow the sort of debate circuit online, you watch apologists like William Lane Craig, you'd probably be familiar with a version that just goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. That's the first premise. And the second one, the second premise of the argument states that objective moral values and duties do exist, which from those two premises we can infer that God does exist. This is a valid deduction known as modus tollens, where you deny the consequent of a conditional statement and therefore deny the antecedent. The antecedent says that God doesn't exist, so we deny that because moral values and duties do exist. Now, it's not enough to just say that an argument's valid. That just means that the conclusion follows by necessity given the premises. But we really want to know whether or not the argument is sound, and that means that the premises are true. If the premises are true and the argument is valid, then the conclusion must be true. And so that's the sort of aim of the argument. Now, one might be compelled, if one is committed to atheism, to look at the conclusion, God exists, and say, I don't accept that. And so then you go back and look at which premise you're willing to give up on. Say, well, this premise is false. But what I'm going to try to do is motivate why I think both premises may be true. And then through that process, I think we might need to refine the premises a little bit more and discuss how exactly we're to understand each premise. So the first premise says that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Well, why think that's true? One reason to think it's true is that many atheists already agree with that statement. That many atheists see the implication of the non-existence of God and the non-existence of objective moral values and duties. So, for instance, we see the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre say, the existentialist, this is an atheistic existentialist, thinks it is very distressing that God does not exist, because all possibility of finding values in a heaven of ideas disappears along with him. There can no longer be an a priori good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Nowhere is it written that good exists, that we must be honest, that we must not lie, because the fact is we are on a plane where there are only men. So Sartre essentially says that we are free because God doesn't exist. We are free to select our own value set. The set we choose is good simply because we choose it and for no other reason. So we might say that certain atheists already admit to this, but that might not be very compelling because maybe Sartre is wrong. Sartre is sort of inspired by Nietzsche, who envisions the death of God as a first premise towards the reevaluation of all values, and that ultimately we, as humans, are free to select our own value set. If we are free to select our own value set, then moral values and duties are merely subjective. They're merely mind-determined choices or mind-selected values. And so we don't really appeal to anything objective in the world when we make that choice, which would mean that ultimately moral values and duties are arbitrary. And so that would be one reason to think that premise 1 is true. But what about premise 2? Premise 2 says that objective moral values and duties do exist. But what do we mean by objective values and duties? And typically we mean something like there are mind-independent values and duties, that a thing is good or evil, or a duty is obligatory, whether or not I happen to think so, or whether society as a sort of aggregate of subjective opinions happens to think so. For it seems that there is no consensus on what moral values and duties we have. So maybe it's the case that there aren't any, this sort of lack of consensus. So one might object to the second premise and say, well, objective moral values and duties don't exist because there's no consensus on what that would be. Can you point to something where everyone would agree that that is an objective value, or that is obligatory? And basically we would say that a consensus doesn't necessarily, or a lack of consensus wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with objective values and duties. First, we have to consider what we would expect the existence of objective moral values, why we would expect it to entail a consensus. And second, we must consider what a consensus means. It may be the case that our minds are not 100% reliable in determining moral values and duties. That we are moral creatures entails certain freedom of the will with regard to what ought to be valued as good and how we ought to behave. But this lack of consensus does little to undercut the objective existence of a thing. Consider, for instance, the case of color blindness. That some people are insensitive to the existence of certain colors does not entail that those colors are merely subjective imaginings of those who do see them, right? So if I see red and my friend doesn't see red, that wouldn't mean that my vision of red is somehow completely subjective and arbitrary. Really, I mean, we would say that vision is a passive sense. I'm receiving red from the world. And that my friend who's colorblind can't see red doesn't mean that there is no objective reality that is the cause of my seeing red. Also, what does it mean to say that there is no consensus on moral matters? Certainly, in the gray areas of moral reasoning, there may be a case for lack of consensus. For example, in abortion, euthanasia, or even something like eating meat, or whether or not gay marriage is moral or immoral. But the argument doesn't require that every moral issue is settled, or even that all moral matters are objective. It could be that some really are just subjective. It just requires that some moral matters are objective. And so there may be someone who believes that, for example, torturing and killing a small child for fun is morally permissible or even morally obligatory. But I would not shy away from asserting that there is still a consensus view that it is immoral to torture and kill a small child for fun, and that those who say it is morally permissible are simply wrong. But perhaps you'll remain unmoved by this. So let's consider the matter from another perspective. I would argue that if objective moral values and duties don't exist, then at any given time, I am never wrong about my moral choices. Let me repeat that. If objective moral values and duties don't exist, then at any given time, I am never wrong about any of my moral choices. But I have a deep sense that I am fallible when it comes to my moral assessments. In fact, even at a given time, when I'm making what I think is the best informed decision, I still have a sense that I could be wrong ultimately about what I think ought to be valued. Therefore, objective moral values and duties would exist. If I can be wrong about my moral assessments, if I believe that, then I do have to be committed to objective moral values and duties. So one might say that when we are wrong about moral choices, we are simply not thinking through what one would ideally decide to do. We were not reflective enough on the situation, and the subjective values would happen to hold. So no appeal to objective moral values and duties are necessary. But even still, I am not merely talking about the failure to reflect on the facts of a situation or a failure to reflect on the subjective value set I happen to hold. I mean that I am keenly aware that I can be wrong about subjective values, the ones that I hold. And that being the case, the fact that I think that I could be wrong about my subjective values themselves means that there must be some standard apart from my subjective values that would be the standard. Another way to think of this is if you believe in moral progress or moral decline, it is very difficult to explain those phenomena while holding a subjective view of values. For at any given time, the values subjectively or even culturally are determined are simply good simply because they're chosen. Those values can be overthrown or changed, but to say that they improve implies an objective measure that can be applied to the subjective measure. If it is only subjective measure, then one's own culture, one's own self will always have chosen the better values at any time. Another way to think of this is a critic of a society's moral values. So say we think of Martin Luther King, who's criticizing atheism. Well, what we could say is that Martin Luther King has his own value set and society has their own value set. Neither is right or wrong objectively. They simply disagree. But I think we would say that one has to be right and the other has to be wrong, right? That Martin Luther King has a certain moral stance against the society and is criticizing the society for a good reason. And that when the society does adopt the critic's position, the society improves its moral status. Some further objections to consider with regard to this argument. Number one, does this suggest that atheists cannot be moral or that atheism is immoral? I'd say on the contrary, a person who advances the moral argument would have to admit that there's some objective standard by which everyone is held to. And so an atheist isn't somehow immoral just simply because they happen to lack a belief in God. They can do many good things. And in fact, if one is a Christian, one has to admit that in the second chapter of Romans, it says that that the natural law is inscribed on everyone's heart, and that St. Paul is referring there to the Romans, that they can indeed live up to the moral law. On the other hand, we also have to say that on classical theism or in particular Christianity, no one lives up to the law perfectly. And so the atheist, I cannot say that the atheist is ever going to live up to moral perfection any more than I, as a Christian, could live up to moral perfection. We all have our failings. And I think for some atheists who maybe should believe in God based on the evidence, or should be compelled to believe on the evidence, the fact that they refuse to worship God or something like that may be a moral failing on my view. But on the other hand, I would not condemn them on that grounds any more than I would want them to condemn me for my moral failings. So I would say that this is sort of a distraction, a red herring to the argument, whether or not this implies that atheists are immoral. Because really, if there is some sort of objective standard, we're all falling short of it. We are all immoral if there is a subjective standard. So yes, in a certain sense, the argument does entail that atheists can be immoral. It also entails that they can be moral. So it entails both. Another objection is that there are many moral theories, normative theories out there that objectively discuss moral values without appeal to God. So, for example, an atheist might point to utilitarianism or ethical egoism or Kantian deontology or virtue ethics or social contract theory. There are lots of other theories out there, and insisting that morality has to be some sort of God-dependent normative theory is too strong a position. But the question we are raising is not which normative theory is correct. I'm not insisting, for instance, that a normative theory called divine command theory is correct. Divine command theory is a normative theory that says that an action or duty is moral simply because God commands it. I'm not advancing that. What I'm advancing is that God is an ontological basis for the convergence of facts and values, that God implies that we can have a standard, or we can have some sort of underpinning to moral judgments. In other words, our concern is not one of normative theory, but of moral ontology. And interestingly enough, the alternatives that are given in moral ontology are really split down between natural ontologies and non-natural ones. So typically, we have to ground it in some natural fact in the world, or we have to ground it in something that is non-natural, which I would say the best non-natural answer would be a God-like being. Typically, those natural ontologies appeal to some fact in our being, some fact about how we've evolved, or something to that effect, that we value altruism or cooperation, or that we are sort of evolved to value our own well-being. But one could always raise the question of whether we ought to value altruism. Should we really value cooperation? Should we really value human well-being? And you might say, well, of course. But it's sort of an assumption. It's always an assumption that the well-being is good, or that cooperation is good, or that altruism is good. And we need to sort of ask ourselves, do we have any good reason for accepting that? In fact, these facts are contingent upon the accidents of history, right? And culture. So it doesn't seem like sort of these accidents could be a good foundation for morality. But this raises a good point, because I think that the moral argument could be strengthened to avoid this objection. For while our evolutionary theory, history, our physiology, and other facts could be seen as objective, they do not seem like they are necessarily good in themselves. So one way I would tweak the original argument that I gave, let me just repeat it, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. and objective moral values and duties do exist, so God exists. One way I would tweak or change that argument is, instead of talking about objective moral values, I would like to consider the question of whether there are intrinsic moral values. Now, an intrinsic moral value is is something that is valued in and of itself. So it will be objective in a sense, but not all objective values are necessarily intrinsic. So the intrinsic value set would be smaller and contained within the objective value set. Rather, we want to say that moral values exist in their own right, valuable in themselves, even if one doesn't happen to value them. Another sort of objection common to moral argument would be the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro's dilemma is often put to the theist who employs the moral argument for God's existence. I think it's important to consider this objection, as it will help us to better understand the moral argument. Euthyphro's dilemma poses a couple of possibilities. On the one hand, the good is the good because God commands it. Or, on the other hand, God commands the good because it is good. If it is the former, that the good is the good because God commands it, then moral values and duties exist apart from God, since they are what causes God to command his morality. If it's the latter, then God is the cause of morality. But whatever he selects as good cannot be based on anything objective, so it's arbitrary. Note then that the Euthyphro dilemma forces the theist to concede that moral values do not depend on God, or that they are, in a sense, arbitrarily and subjectively determined by God. But note that saying that certain values and duties are good because God chooses them is simply to resort to subjective or extrinsic values, and we're looking for intrinsic and objective values. So I would agree that that would be arbitrary. A classic response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to say that it is a false dilemma, that the alternatives are not exhaustive. So what is one of the other alternatives? One of them is that God doesn't choose the value in so far as sort of this arbitrary choice. Rather, God's nature is the source or the standard of moral goodness. In classical theology, and this sort of helps to explain why this solution might come about, God is said to be simple. This means that God is not made of parts. So whatever is attributed to God is attributed to the whole of God's being. A further implication of this is that these attributes of God are really identical with God as one another. So on this conception, God's knowledge, will, power, essence, and goodness are just diverse ways we happen to be speaking of one being. It is said that God's essence is existence. God is a necessary being who exists in virtue of what God is. This is significant because it means that for the theist, there is a necessary being whose existence is identical with goodness. What's more, everything else that exists does so insofar as they receive existence from God. So the theist is motivated to say that intrinsic moral values exist because existence and goodness share an identical cause and are formally identical in that cause. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and give another formulation of this argument, and then I'll end with my own version of a moral argument. But first, I'm getting a bit of feedback. I'm not sure if this is interfering into the conversation, if the mic... There's other live mics.
Hello, Daniel. This is your producer, Joey Livingston.
Yes.
You were the only live mic. There may be some Skype feedback coming to you. Hopefully, Skype will work its magic out for you, but you're coming through just fine. Sorry for your trouble.
Just wanted to double check there. Okay.
Right. Thank you.
So here we have a another formulation. So we've sort of been working through the initial formulation of the argument, which depended on objective values and duties. Another version, and this is sort of interesting because typically one moral theory that one appeals to is somehow God independent would be Kantian morality. But Kant himself formulated a moral argument based on his moral theory. And so we have to sort of understand a little bit about Kantian ethics. But basically, what we have to sort of say is that on the Kantian view, morality is dependent upon objective commands that come to it, are issued by reason itself. And so he talks about the categorical imperative, which essentially states that we have to consider anything that we will to become a universal law of nature. And if that, in so willing, entails a contradiction in our will, then it is immoral. Now, this seems like it doesn't require God, but Kant actually does argue that ultimately his whole moral theory depends upon the rationality of morality. And if morality proves itself to be irrational, then one would not be obligated to be moral. So here's how we should understand it. To understand the Kantian moral argument, we have to have a couple of other key ideas down. The first is the principle that ought implies can. That if I am morally responsible for something, that I'm morally responsible to do some action, then I cannot, then I must be able to do it. I can't be held morally responsible to uphold a duty that I cannot possibly perform. For instance, I have no obligation to try to extend the life of everyone in the world forever. I can't do it. So I couldn't have that moral obligation, even if it would be really nice to do it. I can only be obligated or held morally responsible for something if I can do something about it. So that's one key idea here. The second key idea is the idea of the summum bonum, the highest good. For Kant, the highest good is complete and perfect, and we have an obligation to try to attain it. But what is the highest good? Kant thinks that it is a sort of happiness that arises from and is proportionate to moral goodness. That is, living according to the maxims of a good will should harmonize with the kind of happiness that it produces. The interesting thing is that when we look at the world around us, it appears that happiness is not awarded proportionately with virtuous or moral living. In fact, the moral person often has to forego at least certain kinds of pleasures and joys in order to live a consistent moral life. So it does not appear as though the natural order accords with the moral order. But Kant argues that we actually have a duty not merely to be good, but to attain happiness that is justly deserved. Kant's point is that we cannot bring about this highest good ourselves, nor does nature open up the possibility. If the summum bonum can be attained, it would only be because God rectifies the natural order such that, despite all appearances and experiential evidence to the contrary, moral perfection can be attained. So how can we understand this argument, sort of premises in the same way we understood the first argument? Well, the first premise would state that it is rationally and morally obligatory to attain the highest good, that is, that we achieve happiness as it arises out of complete virtue. And second, if it is rationally and morally obligatory to attain this highest good, then it is possible to achieve the highest good. But if it is possible to achieve the highest good, the natural order and causality does accord with the moral order. And if natural order and causality accords with the moral order, that they can be harmonized, then theism would be the best explanation for our moral obligations. Therefore, theism is the best explanation for our moral obligations. The argument would follow. What can we say with respect to this argument? Now, one might reject the first premise. In fact, a rather pejorative notion of Kantian morality is that it is a miserable moral system, one where a person must be unhappy in order to be virtuous. This is ironic, since Kant himself makes it explicit that we have a certain duty to attain happiness. He says this, he calls it an imperfect duty at one point, but then when we understand the highest good, we have to understand it as a complete good, which would entail happiness as well. Kant thinks that if the moral life did not involve happiness, then practical wisdom, or practical reason rather, would resist morality altogether. In other words, morality would not be rational, since morality would involve injustice, right? The injustice of the good being miserable and the evil being happy, which is a kind of moral imperfection. Thus, the highest moral perfection would involve moral imperfection, which is a contradiction. Justice requires that there is a being with the knowledge, power, and will to rectify all wrongs and restore all happiness according to the measure of one's goodness. Another objection one might mount is to resist the thesis ought implies can. Perhaps we have obligations that we simply cannot live up to. I think for Kant, this would once again suggest that morality would be fundamentally irrational and imperfect. And so one would not really be obligated by it at all. Premise three, let me restate it briefly, is that if the sunum bonum is possible to achieve, then the natural order and causality accords with the moral order. So that is, the possibility of the highest good entails the accord between nature and morality. And what can we say about this? Well, I would say that if the cosmos is going to be just, it must be ordered in such a way, in a just sort of way. Justice is intentional, it's intended. It is a directedness towards a certain harmony. And another way to put this premise is to say that justice doesn't happen by accident. Harmony by accident is just dumb luck. What about the fourth premise? It essentially states this again: if natural order and causality accords with the moral order and causality, then theism is the best explanation. Premise 4 essentially states that a morally perfect, omniscient, omnipotent mind can account for cosmic justice, whereas the naturalistic worldviews could at best appeal to some kind of karmic principle, which doesn't always seem to pan out, given that the wicked often appear to succeed and achieve happiness, whereas the good often live in misery. So you could appeal to sort of this karmic principle to try to defeat the fourth premise and say there's some sort of natural karma, but ultimately our observations sort of entail the opposite conclusion. Or instead of the karmic principle, one could appeal to just dumb luck, as we said before. But it would seem incredible that the universe would, in some future state, resurrect all of the dead, mete out misery and happiness in due proportion, just by dumb luck. So I would say that theism really is the best answer for how we could say that nature and morality could be rendered in harmony. But if all these premises are true, then it is reasonable to believe in God. So those are two sort of very different ways of approaching the moral argument. And I do have my own formulation of this argument. I'm not going to have too much time to unpack it, but let me go back and sort of give you how I would argue the moral argument. And it goes back to this idea of intrinsic moral values. I think that intrinsic moral values are necessary. That is, if it's true that an intrinsic moral value exists, and what would be an example? Something like all humans have value in and of themselves, that they all have dignity, that they're not just valued insofar as I can use them to some other end. They're valued even if I don't happen to value them. Well, I think that's true in every possible way. And it's necessarily true. And so one thing that I would argue is that if you grant that it's even possible that intrinsic moral values exist, the concept is logically coherent, it would follow that they actually do exist. This is a consequence of modal logic, an axiom called the S5 axiom. You might be familiar with it from the ontological argument. So one thing that I would argue is that if it's even possible that intrinsic moral values exist, then we are committed to saying that they do exist. And if they do exist, we could further argue that the idea that God is both the ground of being, God is that whose essence is to exist, and God is good, then the theistic position is that the very same thing that is essentially existing is the very same thing that is essentially good, and that from the top down, the formal cause, the eminent cause of all of reality is existence and goodness, and that those are identical. That is, there is no fact-value dichotomy in theism. To exist is in always some way good. This is an Augustinian point. To exist is a kind of goodness, and evil is a lack of substance. It's a privation. So if that's the case, we can reject the sort of principle that or fork that Hume devises, where is and ought do not follow from one another, that facts and values are disparate and cannot be brought together. In fact, on theism, existence and value are sort of infused and are one. So I would argue that if intrinsic values exist, then God exists, right? And given that intrinsic values are at least possible, they do exist, so God exists. That's sort of my own formulation of the argument. So I'd like to give some time for some questions. Do we have some questions? Don't have any questions from the audience. If we don't have any questions, then I guess what I'll do is I can just summarize again the arguments. So the first one was that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. And we suggested that objective really should shift towards a discussion of intrinsic values. The other argument was basically that in order to be moral, or in order to be morally obligated to the highest good, it has to be the case that ultimately nature and moral values can be harmonized. And that could only be the case if at some future state God does rectify and restore all of creation. And lastly, I argued that if moral values and duties are at least possible in some way, then they actually would exist. And if they do exist, then I would conclude that God exists. So those are my moral arguments for the existence of God. I hope that I've unpacked some of the standard objections and given you some food for thought. Oh, let's see here. So I guess at this point, I'll sign off. Thank you.